The hardest thing Marcus Hale had ever done was not showing up. It was continuing to show up after everything he sent came back stamped with silence. The church was a small one, built in the 1940s from pale brick, with wooden pews worn smooth at the armrests and stained glass windows that rendered the morning light in amber and deep blue. It sat on a street lined with live oaks in a neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia, where the air in November had not yet decided whether it was fall or winter and made both arguments simultaneously. The parking lot was full, cars spilled down the block. A florist's van was parked near the side entrance with its back doors open and empty. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before he went in. He had driven from Atlanta. He had left at 5 in the morning before Ava woke up, because he needed to arrive before the service, and because he had not wanted his 6-year-old daughter to see him in the state he'd been in since the call came. His mother, Clara, was with Ava. Clara had held Marcus for a long time in the kitchen the night before, and then said with the directness she had used to raise him, "You are not going to let your son be buried without his father in the room." Marcus had said, "They might not let me in." Clara had said, "Then you will have stood there. That is different from not going." He wore his black suit. It was the only black suit he owned, purchased for his wife's funeral 4 years ago, let out once at the chest. The tie was navy, a color he had discovered. Knotting it in the bathroom at 4:30 in the morning was darker than he'd realized. He had tied it and then realized his hands were shaking, and he had knotted it a second time and gone. He was 39 years old, and he was about to walk into the funeral of his 10-year-old son. Ethan Marcus Hale had been born in a hospital in Augusta on a Tuesday in February. He had first been small, and he had been loud, and he had come into the world with the expression of someone with objections to register, which was a description Marcus had laughed about with his own mother, and which had proved accurate. Ethan had been a child with a specific aliveness to him, curious about everything, fiercely loyal to his opinions, in love with baseball and model cars, and the kind of action movies that required parental guidance he usually obtained by asking his grandmother instead of his parents. He had been, in the years Marcus had access to him, the gravitational center of whatever room he was in. The divorce had been final when Ethan was 3. Marcus and Denise had been unhappy in the specific way that two people who married young and differently can be unhappy. Not with screaming or violence, but with a growing distance that became, eventually, impassable. The divorce had been civil in the legal sense, which meant it had been managed by attorneys and produced comments, and the documents had given Marcus standard visitation. Alternate weekends, 2 weeks in the summer, every other holiday. He had complied. He had showed up every time. He had been standing outside Denise's apartment in Augusta on the first scheduled visitation when Denise did not answer the door and did not answer her phone, and a neighbor told him she had moved 3 days ago. This was the beginning of 7 years. He had hired an attorney. He had gone back to court. He had tracked addresses. He had sent letters to every address he had for Ethan, decorated with the baseball team Ethan loved. The ones that Marcus had been told, in the brief period before the phone number changed, were Ethan's favorites. He had sent money each month, documented by bank transfer, into an account Denise had established for child support. He had sent birthday cards. He had kept copies of every card, every transfer, every letter, in a file that grew heavier each year, and which he kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the apartment in Atlanta, where he now lived with Ava. Ava's mother, Renee, had been a woman Marcus had known briefly and loved carefully in the period after the divorce, before the legal proceedings had consumed everything else. Renee had died of a pulmonary embolism when Ava was 5 months old, which was the kind of specific cruelty that makes a person reevaluate what the universe is or is not trying to do. Marcus had raised Ava alone in Atlanta, working maintenance shifts at a hospital that allowed him to work nights when Ava was small and sleeping, and days when she was old enough for preschool, and had arranged his life around her with the careful attention of a man who understood what can be lost when a father is not present. He had never stopped trying to reach Ethan. The most recent letter had come back 2 weeks before the phone call. The envelope was marked "Return to sender," no forwarding address, and Marcus had added it to the file and sat with it for an evening, not in despair but in the patient, grinding resolve of someone who has made a decision that the circumstances have not changed. He had been preparing to try a different approach. A social worker he'd spoken with had given him a new name, a new avenue, when his mother's called and said that Denise had reached out to her through a mutual acquaintance, and that Ethan had been in a car accident 4 days ago, and that Ethan was gone. He had sat down in his kitchen, and he had not moved for a very long time. Ava had come and stood in the kitchen doorway. She was 6 years old, and she had seen her father in many conditions, and she understood, with the specific intelligence of children who are raised by one grieving parent, how to be in the room when the room required stillness. She had gone to him and placed her hand on his arm and not said anything, and he had covered her hand with his, and they had sat there together in the kitchen until the weight of the moment began to find its edges. The church was full when Marcus walked in. He walked in through the main doors, which were open, because he was not going in through any other door. The interior was warm and smelled of flowers and candle wax. The pews were full, with more people standing at the sides and in the back. At the front of the center aisle, on a white draped table, was the coffin. It was white with rounded corners, and on top of it someone had placed a small red model car. Marcus stopped in the aisle. His eyes went to the coffin and stayed there for a moment. Then Denise stood up. She had been in the front pew, in black, between her mother and her husband, Elliot Carter. She stood and she said, in a voice that she had clearly prepared, "You are not welcome here." The church went still. Elliot stepped out of the pew and into the aisle. He was a large man, well-dressed, with the composed expression of someone who has decided on an action and is executing it. "You walked away from that boy for 10 years, he said. "Don't make this day about you." Marcus looked at him. He had rehearsed nothing. He had decided, driving through the dark at 5 in the morning, that he was not going to argue. He was not going to produce the file from the bottom drawer of his desk. He was not going to explain himself to a church full of people who had been given a story about him and had lived inside that story for years. He was going to walk to his son and say goodbye, and if they prevented that, he was going to stand where he stood and be there, because being there was the only thing left available to him. "I'm here for Ethan," he said. "That's all." "His name is Ethan Carter," Elliot said. Marcus absorbed this. "His name is Ethan Hale." From the pews, the murmur started. Low, not directed at anyone specifically, but carrying judgment the way that community murmurs always do, collected, amplified, impossible to attribute individually. He heard portions of it. The shape of it was familiar. It was the story of an absent father, the story that had been living in this community for 7 years, told and retold until its surfaces were smooth from handling. In his jacket pocket was 7 years of evidence that the story was wrong. He did not reach for it. If you are watching somewhere far away, leave a comment and let us know. This story is for everyone who has ever been misread by a room. He had not reached for the documentation because bringing documentation to his son's funeral was not what a father does. A father does not defend himself at the funeral. A father stands in the center of the room where his child is and holds the grief without asking for witnesses. Pastor Thomas Avery came down from the front of the church with the expression of a man caught between two things he did not know how to hold simultaneously. He was 57, a round-faced man with kind eyes and the particular weariness of a pastor who has seen the full range of what grief does to people. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly. "Perhaps it would be better." "I'll stand in the back," Marcus said. "I won't speak. I won't disrupt. I just want to be in the room." Denise from the pew said, "Remove him." 2 men from the family section started to rise, and then a sound moved through the church that was different from the murmuring. It was the sound of someone getting up quickly, feet on hardwood, and then a voice, a child's voice, pitched high with urgency and something that sounded like desperation and something else that sounded, underneath the desperation, like courage. Noah Bennett was 10 years old and had been Ethan's best friend since 2nd grade. He had been sitting in the 2nd row with his parents, and he was now standing in the aisle between Marcus and the front, and in both his hands he was holding a white envelope. The envelope was crumpled at one corner, and the handwriting on the outside was in pencil. Noah looked at Pastor Avery. "Ethan told me," Noah said, breathing hard. "He said if his dad came, he said, 'Give this to Pastor Avery, he made me promise.'" He held the envelope out. The church went completely still. Pastor Avery took the envelope. He looked at it for a moment, the pencil handwriting on the outside, which read simply, "For Pastor Avery, if my dad comes." He opened it carefully. He read it once to himself. Then he looked up at the congregation, at Denise, at Marcus, at the white coffin at the front of the room with the model car on top. He read it aloud. The handwriting was uneven. The way a 10-year-old's handwriting is when the message is important and the hand is moving a little faster than usual. "If my dad comes, please don't let Mom make him leave. She says he forgot me, but I found the letters. He didn't forget. Someone hid him from me. I love you. Pastor, please tell my dad I know he tried." The reading of it took 14 seconds. What it did to the room took longer. Denise sat down. She did not do it deliberately. Her legs simply produced the motion as if the structure that had been supporting her had changed its mind. Elliot looked at his wife. Marcus closed his eyes. He stood in the aisle with his eyes closed and he breathed. In his jacket pocket was a file that suddenly weighed much less than it had for 7 years, not because it contained less, but because a 10-year-old boy had done what no legal proceeding and no bank transfer and no returned letter had been able to do. He had said, in pencil, in the voice that was irrefutably his own, the thing that was true. Pastor Avery did not ask Marcus to leave. He said, "Will you come forward?" Marcus walked down the aisle. He stood beside the coffin, and he put one hand on the white surface, and he said nothing. He did not have words. He was not a man who looked for words when no words were adequate. He simply stood there with his hand on the coffin, and he stayed. The service continued. 2 days. After the funeral, Clara drove Ava to Savannah so that Marcus could take more time before the drive back. They stayed in a motel near the river. Clara made coffee in the small machine on the dresser and sat across from Marcus at the table. And they talked and didn't talk in the way that people do when something large has happened. And the large thing is taking its time settling into the shape of what life will be afterward. Ava was on the bed watching a cartoon, one knee bent, one leg hanging off the edge, Button the stuffed rabbit under her arm. She had been told in the clearest possible terms appropriate to a 6-year-old that her brother Ethan had died, that he had been her brother even though they had never met, and that the sadness she saw in her father was real and was allowed to be there. She had listened to this with the focused attention she gave to important things, and had then asked, "Is he in heaven?" Marcus had said he hoped so. She had said, "I'll pray for him then." And she had done so that night in the specific, earnest, slightly disorganized way of a 6-year-old conducting private theological business. She came off the bed now and crossed to the table and looked at her father. "Daddy," she said, "if we sent a letter to heaven, do you think Ethan would get it?" Marcus looked at his daughter. The grief was still there. It was not going to be somewhere else for a very long time, but it had, in the last 2 days, found a form that could be lived in, rather than a form that simply pressed from all sides. He said, "I don't know." Ava thought about this with the gravity of someone taking it seriously. She said, "But we'd still send it, right? Because love doesn't stop just because the mail is hard." Clara looked out the window at the river. Marcus said, "Yes, baby, we'd still send it." Noah came to the motel the next afternoon. His parents drove him. He was a quiet child under ordinary circumstances, and a very quiet child under these. And he came with a paper grocery bag that he held in both arms. He had brought it himself, he said, from his house, where Ethan had left things in the last few months. Ethan had been to Noah's house a great deal in the months before the accident. His mother had been working longer hours, and Elliot's presence in the house had expanded to fill the space. And Ethan had spent time at Noah's this way that children sometimes find a house that becomes a secondary refuge. Not because their own home is dangerous, but because something in the other's house is easier. Noah set the bag on the table. Inside was a letter in Ethan's handwriting, not finished, that began, "Dad, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I found the box. There were pictures in it. I saw your face. There was a baseball card, a Braves card. One of the team Marcus had told Ethan was his favorite in one of the phone calls they had been allowed, briefly when Ethan was 5, and the number was still working. There was a drawing, 2 figures. A man in the foreground, labeled Elliot, standing close. A man in the background, labeled Dad, with a baseball cap that matched one in a photograph that Marcus had sent with a Christmas card when Ethan was 7. Below the 2 figures in Ethan's handwriting. Maybe he remembers. Marcus looked at the drawing for a long time. Noah said, "He talked about you." He was looking at the table when he said it, the way children sometimes deliver the hardest truths. Sideways, with their eyes elsewhere, because looking at the person would make it too much. He said he wasn't sure, for a long time. But then he found the box, and after that he was sure. Marcus said, "Thank you for giving him the letter." Noah shook his head. "I almost didn't. I was scared." Marcus looked at the 10-year-old across the table. "You were in a room full of adults who didn't want to hear what you had to say. You said it anyway. That's not almost. That's what you did." Noah's eyes went bright. He pressed his lips together for a moment. He nodded. His parents took him home an hour later. At the door, Noah turned back and said, "He wanted you at his birthday. I know because he told me. In March. He would have been 11. Marcus said, "I know." Noah said, "He would have liked you. Not just like because you're his dad. Like actually liked." Marcus said, "I would have liked him too." He stood in the doorway until Noah's parents' car turned the corner. And then he closed the door and sat down at the motel table and put his face in his hands and let the crying come that had been waiting 2 days for the right moment. Because some grief requires privacy before it can be honest. Ava climbed onto the bed beside him and put her small hand on his back. She didn't say anything. She was 6 years old, and she already understood that sometimes a hand on the back is the whole thing. What happened with Denise in the weeks afterward was not dramatic in the way that confrontations in stories sometimes are. It was smaller and sadder than that. She called Marcus's attorney first, then she called Clara, and then she called Marcus directly, and she said, "I didn't think it would happen like this." Marcus said, "Nobody thinks about the endgame when they're making decisions that feel like protection," she said. "I was angry." "I know you were," he said. "I know some of it I gave you reason for. The marriage was hard for both of us. But Ethan wasn't the marriage. He was separate from all of it, and I never got to make him understand that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He understood more than I knew." Marcus said, "Yes, he did." She asked him if he would consider forgiving her. He told her the truth, that forgiveness was not something he had available to give yet, and that he did not want to give a word for something he didn't feel, because words that didn't correspond to reality were part of what had caused this in the first place. She received this without argument, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done in 7 years. Elliot did not call. The marriage between Denise and Elliot, which had already been under the particular pressure of a household built partly on a story that was no longer available to tell, did not survive the following spring. The cow fowl had been updated at Pastor Avery's insistence after a conversation with Denise that he later described in his personal journal as the hardest pastoral conversation of his ministry. The amended version read, "Ethan Marcus Hale is survived by his father, Marcus Hale, his sister Ava Hale, and his grandmother Clara Hale." Marcus looked at it for a long time when it arrived in the mail. It was not enough, it could not be enough. But it was his son's name, and it had his own name beside it, and neither name had been erased. 6 months after the funeral, Pastor Avery approached Marcus about something he had been thinking about since he read the letter out loud in the church and watched the room change. He wanted to create something that would honor Ethan. Not a memorial that functioned as decoration, a tree planted, a plaque mounted, but something that addressed the specific situation in which Ethan had found himself. A child between two stories, unable to determine which was true, with no channel through which to access information that would help him. Ethan had found the box on his own. He had solved his own problem with the tools available to him, which had been his own intelligence and his own refusal to accept a version of his father that did not match the evidence. Not every child could do this. Not every child would be as lucky. The project was called Ethan's Letters. It was small, designed to remain small. It operated through the church and through a partnership with a family law clinic in Savannah. It helped non-custodial parents document their contact attempts in a format that was legally defensible and emotionally clear. It provided brief counseling for parents navigating custody situations where access was being denied informally rather than through legal order. It worked with local school counselors to create channels through which children in these situations could express, safely and confidentially, confusion about absent parents without having to choose a side. It was not a legal advocacy organization. Marcus was clear about this from the beginning. It was not his place to determine who was right in any given custody dispute, because some parents were absent for reasons that were good reasons, and some stories of absence were true stories. The project existed only to create documentation and communication channels that made it harder for the truth to disappear inside silence. Clara ran the administrative side, a retired family court mediator named Patricia Moore, who had worked with Marcus years ago in the original custody proceedings, volunteered 2 half-days a week. Noah Bennett, who had turned 11 by then, and who had been asking his parents since the funeral if he could be involved in something that would mean the situation had mattered, came once a week after school and stuffed envelopes. 1 year after Ethan's death, the church held a small service of remembrance. It was a Sunday afternoon in November, the same gray overcast sky as the year before. But the cold was less cutting, or maybe Marcus had simply developed more capacity for the cold, which is one of the things that happens to people over time when they live in it long enough. The service was small: Clara, Ava, Noah and his parents, Pastor Avery, 3 families who had come through the Ethan's Letters program in the year since it started. Marcus had brought the model car, not the red one from the coffin, which had been buried with Ethan, but a different one, the same make, purchased at a hobby shop in Atlanta because the same make mattered. He placed it on the table beside Ethan's photograph. Noah read a short statement that he had written himself about what Ethan had been like, about the way Ethan had asked questions that other people didn't think to ask, about the way Ethan had believed that people who mattered to you kept trying even when you couldn't see them trying. Pastor Avery spoke. He said that the church had failed Marcus Hale in a specific way, not through malice, but through credulity, through the ease of believing a story, because it was offered clearly and it required nothing of them. He said that communities have a responsibility to ask one more question before they decide who someone is, and that responsibility is harder to fulfill than it sounds. He said he was sorry. He said this in the room, in front of the people in the room, which was the only place an apology of that kind can be made. Marcus read a letter. He had written it at the desk in the apartment in Atlanta over the course of 3 evenings, and he had crossed out and rewritten several times, and the final version was the one that was most honest, which was also the one that was hardest to read in front of people without his voice doing things he had to manage. He read, "Champ, you would be 11 years old this year. I don't know what that would look like on you. I don't know if you would have gotten taller, or if you would still have that look when you were thinking, that look you had at 5 where you went somewhere internal and didn't come back until you'd worked it out. I have your drawing. I have your unfinished letter. I have the baseball card. I keep them in the drawer where I used to keep the file of things that were supposed to prove something to a system that wasn't going to be moved by proof. The file is still there, but I keep it differently now. I keep it because it's yours. The letters I sent you were yours. The birthday cards were yours. Even the ones you received were yours, because I wrote them for you. I am sorry I could not find the door faster. I stood at every door I knew. I am proud of you for finding the one that mattered most." He folded the letter. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that everyone understands is not meant for them specifically and is meant for everyone at once. Ava, who was 7 now, leaned against her father's arm and looked at Ethan's photograph. She had been told about her brother carefully and repeatedly, and she had his photograph on the shelf in her room, and she prayed for him in the specific unself-conscious way she had been praying since she was 6, and she drew him sometimes in the drawings she made at school. A figure with a baseball cap, labeled brother, positioned near the figure labeled daddy. She looked at the photograph for a moment, and then she said, in the small voice she used for important things, "I hope he got all the letters." Marcus looked at her. He put his arm around her. "Me too," he said. After the service, Noah brought the baseball cap, the one Ethan had kept, the one that matched the one in the old photograph from the Christmas card. He held it out to Marcus. "He wanted you to have it," Noah said. "He told me that too." Marcus took it. He held it for a moment, looking at the logo. He said, "You did a good thing, Noah. You were 10 years old and you did a hard thing in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it." Noah said, "I almost left it too late." Marcus said, "No, you didn't. You got it there." Noah nodded. He went back to his parents. Marcus sat in the pew with the baseball cap in his hands. For a few minutes after the others had moved to the table where Clara had put coffee and some cake from the bakery near the church. He was not thinking about anything specific. He was doing the thing that people do when they are in a room that contains the shape of someone they loved and will not see again. Simply being in the room, present, without requiring the room to produce anything other than what it already had. Ava came back for him. "Daddy," she said, "there's cake." He stood. He put the cap on the table with the model car and Ethan's photograph in the configuration of objects that constituted, for this gathering, the closest things to a memorial that the moment afforded. He said, "Okay." They went to the table. There are absences that are chosen, and there are absences that are constructed, built brick by brick from unreturned calls and changed addresses and stories, told enough times that they calcify into fact, until even the people doing the constructing can no longer see what they built or what they buried inside it. Marcus Hale was called an absent father for 7 years in a community that never met him and never looked at the documentation and never asked a second question because the first answer was easier to hold. He sent letters into silence for 7 years. He sent money into a black box. He stood in the parking lots of apartments where the lights were on and no one answered, and he drove back home and opened the desk drawer and added another document to the file. And he got up the next morning and made breakfast for Ava and drove her to school and worked his maintenance shift and came home and helped with homework and sat at the desk after bedtime and wrote another letter to a child he was not allowed to reach. He did not stop. He was not stopped by legal failure or by the community's judgment or by the specific grinding exhaustion of being the wrong person in a story someone else was telling. He continued because he was Ethan's father. And a father does not cancel his fatherhood because the address changes. And Ethan Hale, who was 10 years old and had found a box in a closet with letters in it that changed his understanding of who had been trying to reach him and who had been standing between them. Did the thing that children sometimes do when adults have failed them. He took the problem into his own hands. He asked Noah to keep the envelope. He wrote in pencil in the handwriting of a child who has something urgent to say and is saying it as clearly as he can. He made sure his father could get through the door, a boy of 10. Letters and a promise and a friend willing to run to the front of a church. These were the tools. They were enough. There is no version of this story that ends with everything restored. The years do not come back. The birthday cakes and the baseball games and the drives home from practice and the conversations about nothing that are actually conversations about everything. These are not recoverable. They exist in a category of loss that is not addressed by apology or legal proceeding or any arrangement of words. But there is as a cow faw with Marcus Hale's name in it. There is a program named for a boy who did not accept a lie as the final word about his father. There is a 6-year-old girl who prays for her brother and draws him next to the word daddy. There is a baseball cap on a memorial table, and beside it a model car, and beside that a photograph of a boy with his father's eyes. And there is a man who drove 5 hours in the dark to stand in the room where his son was, because his mother told him there is a difference between not going and standing there and being made to leave. He went, he stood. He was not made to leave. In the end, the only thing that mattered was that the door finally opened, and Ethan was the one who had the key. Daddy came. Daddy tried. Daddy never forgot.